Okay, so hey everyone, in this video we are going to implement unit and integration testing within our backend project. Okay, so it is very crucial in order to implement testing within our backend applications so that we change any kind of code and we feel that everything might work very fine. Okay, but later when you check in production, you might face some particular bugs because that one particular change might affect your whole application. Okay, so that is why if we write kind of something like unit testing or integration testing, so by the just help of one command, it will just test whatever you have written and it will just execute all of your files and just check if everything is working fine or not. Okay, so especially when you're working in teams, like let's say if another developer comes here and just changes one line of code, so that will affect the entire application, right? So that is why it is always important to always consider unit testing at least for your node.js backend project. Okay, so that is what we are going to implement within this video, and I will just take you step by step how exactly you can implement unit as well as integration testing by using a very modern and popular testing library, that is vtest. Okay, and also we are going to integrate super test in order to test any kind of APIs which is used to fake APIs and give us the response. So the advantage of writing tests is that once we write the test, we don't have to even touch that file as long as our tests are perfectly working fine. Okay, and sometimes in later if you add some particular feature, we might have to go back and edit that test file, but rest of the time with the help of one particular command, it will run all of your tests and give you the results. Okay, so that's the best thing, and the bad news is that we have to learn, this is a particular skill which we need to learn from scratch and then implement all by ourselves. Okay, so that's a little bit pain which we have to do it, but as I told, the good news is that once we write these tests, we don't have to even touch them. Okay, just by the help of one command we can run all of our tests and we just check if all of them are passing or not. So this is the library which we will be using within our backend project, that is vtest. Okay, so if you would have also learned about testing libraries, you would have also heard of jest. Okay, which is almost similar to vtest, but vtest is slightly better than that and it is more modern and it is compatible for ES modules, TypeScript and JSX, just as it is mentioned over here. Okay, so and as well as it says that it's just compatible as well, doesn't mean that jest is deprecated and no longer using. It is still working and perfectly fine. However, this particular library is the current standard and you might want to consider using this from now onward. So like when it comes to jest or vtest, always like try to consider vtest. Okay, so let me make this clear. Vtest is a testing as well as an assertion library. Okay, so I'll just come to these terms, what is testing and assertion means. So testing is basically you write your tests. Assertions are something that gives you the results for the tests we actually write. Okay, so this is both a testing as well as an assertion library, whereas in the past we had many discrete testing as well as assertion libraries, like we have chai and mocha. So let's not go into that. So that's the one thing which I wanted to say, vtest does both. Okay, so currently we can just click on get started and this will give us the documentation, how exactly do we need to install it, and you might want to like have a look at the documentation which is very clearly written over here, and we will be going step by step. Okay, even though you don't understand this, so all we now need to do is just go ahead and install vtest. Okay, so this is the library which will be installing, of course using pnpm, which I already explained why we are using, and in conjunction to vtest we are also going to use another library just for the testing of APIs. Okay, so we are using super test. Okay, so this is also the most popular library in order to test any kind of HTTP requests that we have set up within our backend project. Okay, so basically this will not actually make the API request, so it will just fake it. Okay, so basically this uses Express under the hood and it creates an isolated environment for testing so that our actual APIs doesn't get affected. Okay, so I hope you get the idea. We don't have to create any kind of servers or anything, everything gets taken care by itself. Only thing is we just need to provide our whole context of our backend application into that, and rest of that it will just take care. We just need to write tests and give some assertions. Okay, so again we just need to do an npm install super test, and then from then on we can start writing out tests. So let us now go ahead and install these two libraries from our terminal. So I'm just going to do a pnpm install super test and vtest, and of course this can be installed as a dev dependency, just so we do not need this in production, only for development, right? Testing is only in the development phase, right? So let's go ahead and install these packages. Okay, so once they are installed, we can just create a test file, basically that will contain all of our test suites, basically a collection of tests that will actually run by our library. Okay, so let us go to the root folder and let's create a folder called test, and over there we are going to write our very first test file. Okay, so in this particular video we are going to only test the functionality of registering a user. Okay, so if I just start testing all of the different parts of our backend application, so this video will get very lengthy, right? So I just want to show you how exactly we can implement testing within our backend project. So I've just taken register a user as an example. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a folder for the register, and inside that let's create a register .test.ts. okay, so note that we are prepending the file extension with test. Okay, so this is basically a test file. You see that the icon is also changed, so whenever we run our tests, it will just check for the file that is called as test, and then it will execute that file. Okay, and not any other files. Okay, so there's also called as spec.ts, which people used to use earlier. So currently test.ts is the actual standard. Okay, so we can just use this one. So now let's go ahead and import few things from vtest and just test for one particular functionality to register a particular user. So when the user gets registered, what exactly response do we get such that the user is actually registered, and all of that stuff we are actually going to test, and along with whether the cookies are being set or not, like once the user registers. So all of that. So let's go ahead and import few things from vtest. So I'm just going to import from vtest. Okay, and the first thing which we are going to import is it. Okay, so this is basically a function which we write our tests inside that. Okay, hover on this, so it gives you an example how it is exactly we need to implement. Okay, so you see that it says that this is the name of our test, and then this will take back a function, and we just need to perform our assertions inside of it. Okay, so we are also going to import describe. Okay, so this is basically a collection of tests that we write within this file. Okay, so which will test for a particular functionality. In this example we are testing the register functionality, right? So we can just contain everything within this describe block. Okay, so in technical terms it is called as a test suite. Okay, so that's the thing. And finally we want to assert something. So basically we want to expect once we make a request what exactly the results that it gives us, and we just need to check if that particular result pertains to this value or not. Okay, so let us import expect. Okay, all from vtest. And the next thing which we want to import is from super test. Okay, basically the request object which we can call and specify our endpoint, and then we can pass in some data and then expect some results. Okay, so this will actually be imported from the super test library. So we can just import request, so that is coming from super test. So it also gives us an error here saying that we also need to install the types from super test. So let's go ahead and just do that. So this is pnpm install, that is types/super test. Okay, so once that's done, that error should go away. So now let's go ahead and write our very first test. Okay, so before that let us contain inside this describe block just to create a test suite for our register functionality. So I'm just going to call describe, and here we just need to give our test suite a name. Okay, so we can just say tests the register functionality. Okay, so whatever name that makes sense you can just pass in over here. So this will basically take in a function inside here, and here we just write all of our tests. Okay, so this is our test which we write inside this it function. So here we just give it a name, like let's say first thing which we are going to check is the user actually registers or not. Okay, so basically if we go to our actual code and within our controllers we have our user controller, right? So we just want to check for test for this particular function, so that is register user. So which we want to check if the name, email, password are in the right format, user whether it is actually existing or not, and once if it doesn't exist, whether the user will actually be created or not with the particular role, okay, which we have within our database. And also once the user is created, does the actual tokens be created and set inside our cookies. So we also want to test for that, and also what the status code that we are getting back, whether it's a 201 or 200. Let's say if some developer comes and just replaces from 201 to let's say 404, So once we run our test files, it will get caught. Okay, so we will know where exactly it is going wrong. So that is the benefit of writing tests. Okay, and also what response does it actually give, and also if there is any error, so this is the actual error that has to be thrown, and a lot many stuff. Okay, and as you might think that this is like completely pointless, we already know that it works. Okay, so basically it is just one time writing our test. Okay, and later we don't even have to touch these files. Okay, so just by a run of command we'll check if everything is working or not. Just as I told, if any naive developer comes and like changes some particular code, our test files will actually catch it. Okay, and also the best part is whenever we are deploying our particular code, we can also integrate it with CI/CD. Okay, so basically whenever we deploying, it will run our CI/CD pipelines, and by checking all of our test cases pass or not. So if it fails, then the code doesn't get pushed. Okay, so that we will not be implementing this video, maybe later. Okay, so this is just the standard implementation on how you can implement CI/CD back in our backend along with our tests. Okay, so usually many companies do that. Enough talking, let's go ahead and write our very first test, which will actually should register a user. So let's say it should register a user. Okay, so this actually makes sense, right? So that is why this particular function is called it. Okay, it should register a user. Okay, so that's why the naming makes sense. Okay, so this will take in a function which we will need to write our tests. Okay, so before writing our tests, I just want to clarify one thing, is that it is always a good practice to follow one particular system. Okay, so that is called as the AAA pattern. Okay, so it stands for arrange, act, and assert. Okay, so let's come to what exactly does it mean. So the first step is arrange. So basically we arrange our values that need to be passed. Okay, so we call this arrange, and this particular thing is basically collection of all the things that needs to be passed within our test function. So the first thing is going to be the endpoint. So I can just call this endpoint. So what is the actual endpoint for our registering user? So we can just set that to /API/users/register. Okay, so make sure this is the actual endpoint. Okay, so then the next thing is the user payload. So we are just going to inject some sample data for the user to be registered, just for the sake of testing. So this user will not be registered, as I told, since Supertest is a completely isolated environment. The request will not actually be created since it's an isolated environment. So let's call this user payload or whatever makes sense. Okay, so inside this will actually take in an object, because these are the three parameters that we actually have defined within our model. So that is the name, email, and password. Okay, so name is, let's call it John, and then email john@example.com, and then finally the password, which we can set to 123456. So basically we have arranged all those things that need to be passed inside our test. So the second step is act. So this will actually execute the test. Okay, so we can just say this as act, and we call the request function from Supertest, which is actually a default export. So we can just this is basically all the API calls are asynchronous, right? So we want to await this and make this an async function. Okay, so even though it's in testing environment, this will also be asynchronous. So we call the request function, and first thing is we want to pass in is the whole context of our application. Okay, so without passing in anything, it doesn't know, right, what our actual code actually does. So we just want to pass in our app. Okay, so which is the entire the logic of our backend, right? So within our app, all of our backend is set up, including the routes. Okay, where API/users is there, then it goes to the user routes. So this is the whole context of our application basically. And here of course we want to make a post request. Okay, so we call the post function, okay, inside request. So dot post, where we can just chain in of course many methods, and then pass in the actual endpoint which we actually arranged over here, so that we can just reuse this particular endpoint in many cases, test cases. So like pass in endpoint, and then we need to pass in some payload. So then we call the send function, and then pass in our user payload. Okay, so you see that this is very simple. So we can probably push this at the top, so that we can just use this in many other functions, many other tests that we actually create. So this is the second stage, that is act. So basically we can just receive the response as well after making the call to our backend, so this endpoint to register a user. So now we can perform assertions. We need to check if this particular response that we get is actually defined. So basically if we go to our user controller, this is what we are returning, right? So we can just check if we are returning some particular information, as well as the important thing, that is the status code. And also we want to check if the returned value is this particular name and email that we are actually getting, okay, because once we register, this is what we return, whatever the name that is passed in inside our controller, so that is what it returns, right, after creating the user. So that is what we just want to test. Okay, so now we say expect and then pass in our response. Okay, so basically it's a function which we pass in response and check the status of it. Okay, so if that is equal to 201 or not, because that's actually what we are setting over here, and we can now chain in many methods. Okay, so this is basically the assertion step, okay, which I can just say it as assert. Okay, and here we can just pass in many things. Okay, so if you just have a look at this, so there are many values which we can actually assert on this. Okay, so like we can currently we just want to check if this value is to be 200 or not, so you can just use the to be function and pass in the 201. So you see that it makes sense. Expect the response dot status to be 201. Okay, so it's easy to read as well. So these are the different steps which we can execute within our particular test. One is the arrange, act, and then assert. And we are not just limited to make one assertion, we can make multiple assertions as well. Just as I told, we can just make another assertion saying that expect the response dot body, because this is dynamic, so we just want to check if the name and the email are returned. Okay, so basically these two things which I can just use it over here. And this is the second assertion. We can just of course chain in multiple assertions as well. So since I told you the ID is dynamic, we just want to check if it is actually even defined within our response dot body object. So we can just put in another assertion saying that expect saying response dot body dot underscore ID, if that is even defined. Okay, so underscore ID to be defined. Okay, so to be defined, you see that it gives us some IntelliSense, and yeah, that's it. So these are the three basic things we are currently testing, and of course there are many other functionalities over here which we haven't tested for, that is access token, refresh token, which we will do after this. Okay, so once that's done, we can now go ahead and set up our test, okay, to run. So basically we see that within our tsconfig.json file we get an error because this test file is not actually being tracked by our tsconfig. Okay, since we have inside our, if you remember within the first video, we had just passed in the root dir, so we have set this only to the source directory where our TypeScript files are currently present, which has to be compiled, right? So we also want to include the test folder which is within our root directory next to the source folder. So we can go right at the bottom and add an include over here, so which is an array which will also take in the source directory as well as the test file. Okay, so first we specify the source, so anything inside the source directory should be captured by TypeScript, and also for the test directory. Okay, so which we can specify test slash star star, which means that anything after that and anything. Okay, and once we do that, we can go ahead and comment out the root directory. Okay, so this particular thing over here, so that error should now go away. Okay. And one more thing, since we changed the root dir within our tsconfig file, right, to pick up from the source and the test folder, so when you compile all of our code, right, so it will be not in the source folder, so it will be inside the source folder, the particular server.js. Okay, so what you need to do is go to package.json and then change our start script to dist slash source slash server.js. Okay, so we can just do the same for the dev as well. Okay, so we can just add a src slash and then server.js. Okay, so that is the only change. So before we go ahead and start testing this, we need to change the environment from development to test. Okay, so within a config file, our current environment is basically development, right, since we are developing, and we can just make this whenever we run the test files, it has to change the environment dynamically to test. Okay, so once we change this to a test, we can go to a database file over here where we can find it over here, and within this we can just put in our check over here. So only if the environment is test, we should not be able to run our database, basically this logic. Okay, so we can just put this inside a block. Okay, and over here we can just check if the environment is actually test. Okay, so if the environment, which we can import from our config file, and check if that is equal to test, only then do we, if that is not equal to test, only then do we actually make a connection to our database. Okay, so once that's done, we can now go ahead and create a script, okay, within our package.json to run all of our test files. So in addition to our start and our dev script, okay, we can also add in our test script. Okay, so basically this is just called test. Okay, so that's the standard. So we can now set our environment variable first, that is node_env, that is the name which I have actually given, and set that to test like this, and then run our actual command, that is vtest. Okay, so if I just run vtest, so this will actually be in watch mode. Okay, so if you just want to run this manually every single time our test ends, we can add in the -- run particular command, which will actually run our test once. Okay, so it will not watch for our file changes. Okay, so this is similar to node 1. So that is I'm just going to set this to run, so I just want to make it run every time. There are many other options as well, where if you want to check the logs, where you want verbose logs, you can just set -- verbose, and then get all the detailed logs if you want. So I'm just going to set this to -- run, and now we can just go ahead and run our test script. Okay, so now I'm just going to my terminal, and over there I'm just going to say npm test. Okay, so you don't have to specify run. So if this is just test, it will just automatically pick up this particular script over here and execute that. So once I hit enter, I'm gonna say you right away that our tests are going to fail. Okay, so not even fail, it just gets stuck. Okay, because we didn't even provide a database, right? So that's the error which we get over here. That is this is a long running test, we get a timeout error. Okay, so one thing is we just need to specify a database where it has to store the particular record, and it has to get the response, right? So that's the logic which we are written over here. So once we make a request, so this is what we are expecting from the mongoose model, that is user, and this is what we are actually returning it, right? That user_id, name and email. So that is where we need to make sure that our database is set up just for the test. Okay, and then once our tests are ended, all the data from our test database gets deleted. Okay, so we are not going to use a actual MongoDB database, but a memory server, okay, which we can actually install that as a package, which is specifically used for testing. Okay, so if I just show you that package, so this is the package which will actually temporarily create a MongoDB server, and using all those modules that we have defined within our controller. So this will actually just fake it, and then it will just give us a response. And once all of our tests are completed, all of its memory gets flushed. Okay, so that's the main purpose of this particular library. Let's go ahead and install this. So I'm just going to do a npm install MongoDB memory server, which is, of course, we need it as a dev dependency, and let's wait for it. Once this is done, we can now go back to our test file, and we just need to provide certain steps, okay, before our test what it has to do, and after our test what it has to do. Okay, so those blocks are also provided by vtest itself. So we can also import the before each, and before all is also there. So I'll just tell you the difference. Before all is basically before all your tests actually execute. Okay, so this particular function will execute. Okay, so if you want, you can just test this in isolation if you want, and just put some console logs and see. And before each is basically this function will execute before every test. Okay, so these are all our tests, right? Before every test this will execute. So before all is only once it will run within this file if you are actually mentioning it. So I just want to create the database server before every single test runs. So I'm importing before all, and also I can import after all. Okay, so once all of our tests run, we can flush all of our data within our memory, and then discard the database which is in memory. So once we have imported that, we can just go right before this describe block and call the before all function, and over here we can specify our particular database logic. Okay, so which actually takes in a callback function, and of course all the database operations are asynchronous. So I'm just going to right away mark this an async. So first thing is we want to import the Mongo memory servers, which I'm going to auto import. So Mongo memory server, which doesn't actually import. So let us manually import this. Import this from Mongo memory server like so. And once we do this, we just want to call a function called as create. Okay, so this will create a MongoDB server, and this will return us some value which we can actually store it within a global variable, which we can use it inside our test. So I'm just going to call this let Mongo, and going to set this type of any, and here we can just assign that to this particular variable. And the next step is I'm going to get the actual connection string that this actually returns us, and integrate that with Mongoose. Okay, so let's store this within Mongo URI, and set this equal to mongo dot get URI, which is actually a function which you can call on this. Okay, so I don't know, for some reason I don't get proper IntelliSense. So anyways, let's again do a await, call the mongoose, so which we can actually import, and then we can do a connect on this and then pass in our URI. Okay, so this is just a temporary URI which will actually be created on the fly before our actual test actually run. Okay, so once that's done, before all of our database logic is set up, and after all of our tests execute, then we can disconnect our database. So now we can call after all, and then of course specify a function over here which is an async function, and inside this we just want to check if our MongoDB actually instance is created, only then do we stop it, otherwise we will get an error. So we say await mongo.stop. Okay, so this is just basic syntax which you will also find within our documentation over here. And after this we just want to disconnect from our mongoose. Okay, so mongoose dot connection dot disconnect. Okay, so sorry, not disconnect, close, my bad. So once this is done, we can now go ahead and run our test files, okay, and check if everything actually passes. So let's go right here and do a pnpm test. Okay, so we get an error here, mongo.stop is not a function, which is my bad, and I actually had to await on this. Okay, so let's run this once again. Okay, this fails. Okay, so we are getting some error here, we are getting 500 error. So the reason for this is, of course, within our user controller we are basically fetching the role from our role model, right? So currently it is not able to fetch this, so that is why we are getting a internal server error. Okay, so because that is what we are actually being catching over here, saying that internal server error, because in our basic MongoDB memory server, it doesn't have context to our role code. Okay, so basically this is coming as undefined, so that is why all of our tests are failing. So what you can just do is, before our every test run, we can just seed some roles within this particular database if you want, or for now I can just comment this out and then try to test without this. Okay, so now if I just go ahead and do a test now, so this time it should pass, and as you see, our tests are now currently passing. Okay, so all of our assertions that we have executed over here, that is status is actually 2 or 1, and our res.body is actually having these properties, that is John and email, and our ID is actually being defined. Okay, so these three are actually are passed over here. So you get a results also over here saying that this is the test suite, okay, which is actually run the test. So basically one file, so you get a test files, that is 1, which is actually passed, and number of tests that are there overall, that is 1, which actually also passed, and what is the start time, duration, and all of that stuff. Okay, so if you want some more information, you can, of course, as I told you, add in that flag of -- verbose, it will give you more information. And also if you want a particular report, okay, you can, there's another flag which you can use, which will actually give you the report. Okay, so you can just check out the documentation for that. I've just added this particular line of code over here. Before our test actually run, it should actually create a user role. Okay, so and then I have uncommented this, so it will just get the role from the role code.user, and it will fetch the role from this role model. Okay, so now let's try to run our tests again. So let's see if it passes. So it does. Okay, so everything, all of our basic functionality that user should register, okay, is actually working. So now, for example, if I just try to make a change over here, like let's say any dumb developer comes and changes some code, he changes the status code from 201 to 404. Okay, so now if I just run our test, so you see that it fails. Okay, because our status code was 404 and we are expecting 201. Okay, so that's the beauty of writing tests. Just by a run of a command, we can just check if all of our test cases are passing or not. Okay, so that is the reason why we need to write tests. So now let's go ahead and write some more tests in order to make sure that all of our functionality as far as our register controller is concerned is actually working. So let's go ahead and write yet another test to check if the email is actually valid. Okay, so write under this it block, we can write in yet another it block over here within this describe block. So basically we are writing a collection of tests, okay, which is basically called as a test suite. So here we can just provide a message saying that it returns 400 basically if it is an invalid email. So it returns 400 with invalid email. Alright, so again this takes in a function where we need to write our tests. Okay, so this is going to be an async function, and over here we just want to again keep doing the same thing. So basically we have the endpoint defined as well as the user payload. So I'm just going to copy this particular line of code, and over here I'm just going to replace this user payload with our own actual payload. Okay, so I can just basically copy this image and I can just replace this, but this time I'm just gonna use an invalid email. Okay, so let's just put in some gibberish over here which is actually invalid. So now we can just go ahead and use our assertions. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this and replace all of these values. So this time it has to expect a status code of 400, okay, which is a bad request. That's what we have actually set. So basically within our user controller, if our email is invalid, so basically we have within our Zod schema, right, within our user schema we have set a schema for the user registration which strictly checks the type of email. Okay, so if it is not a proper email, it returns a message of invalid email. Okay, so we can just get rid of this particular assertion, which is usually to check if something is there within a body. So now we can just check if the body is undefined. Okay, so it returns a false value, because if it returns a 400, our body will be empty, right? So instead of saying to be defined, we can use the inversion of this to be defined, that is by adding not dot to be defined. Okay, so basically it makes sense. So this should not be defined. Okay, so if it defines, then it gives us some error. So we can just write as many assertions as we want. Okay, so currently we have written 2. So if you want to make it more strict, you can just add in more and more. Okay, so just so your code actually is safe. All right, so this is just an example which I showed you, which you could actually consider if you want to invert a particular thing that it has to behave. So currently your body will be defined basically with an error message. So I can just get rid of this and now try to run our test. So now let's do a pnpm test and let's check if that passes, and that passes. Okay, so this time you see that we had 2 test files. Okay, so that's why it says 2 over here, sorry, just 1 test file, and within that test file we have 2 tests. Okay, so that what it actually means. Okay, so these are the 2 tests, and this is the test block, basically the test suite, which contains 2 tests. So these are all the information which actually makes sense if you just try to read them. Okay, so I just went ahead of time and just written 2 more tests in order to save some time actually. So this is a test which will actually return a 400 with missing email and password. So if you just send a empty object without the actual user payload, so we need to expect a 400 bad request. Okay, so that is very simple, as every test actually we need to write this. So if email and password are there, suppose if we get a 201 status without actually creating the user, so that is not how the user authentication should work in a backend, right? So that's what we are testing over here. And also this is another test which actually tests for duplicate emails. So first time I just register a user with a test name, email and password, and then again, so this time I expect a 201. Okay, and again if I just make the request, okay, with the same email, okay, email and password, so I should be getting a 400 status code. Okay, so that is what this test actually does. Or we can just replace this with a user endpoint, by the way, so user payload. So this should actually do the thing. Okay, so this will test for duplicate emails. So first time it expects a 201, and the second time if we have a duplicate email, that should give us a 400. So that's what we have defined within our user controller, which will actually check if the user exists, then it returns a 400. Okay, so this is the functionality. Let's go ahead and now quickly test this if this actually works. Okay, so I'm just repeating this just because you get practice. So here we are getting a failed test over here, so there should be a problem. So basically it returned 400 instead of 201 for the first email that is actually registered. Maybe I know the reason, because we are writing all of this in a before all block, where first time when you create a register user, so with the same user credentials, so that same user will be used here as well, because this is already there in the database. So what we can just do is we can just write another condition over here, that is before each. So before each, it has to delete all the other data that is there within our database, so that it doesn't conflict with the other test cases, okay, so that we just have a fresh database for every test case. So you can just put this inside yet another block over here, that is before each, okay, just as I told. So this is before all, okay, so this is before each, so before each, which you can directly import, and over here which we can just just loop across all the database models that we have within our Mongoose, and then we can just delete whatever the connections we have. So inside this block I have retrieved all the collections that we have within our Mongoose, okay, so we can just get that from mongoose.collection.db.collections, which is a function which returns all the collections. So if it doesn't have any collections, then it returns, if not it deletes all of them by using the delete many operator from Mongoose, okay. So this basically should do the thing for passing all of our tests. So now let's go ahead and run this once again. So this should this time it should pass, okay. So again we are getting a failed thing. So basically I think I missed something, sorry, by mistake I imported this from node test, okay, so this has to come from vtest, so that was the reason it wasn't working. And also let us push this role model create logic inside this, okay. So it's because we are deleting everything and we just want to create that role model for the user again, okay. We can delete this and now we can run our tests, okay. So let's do a npm test, and this time it should pass, right. So all of our test cases are now passing. So let's paste in some more tests, and I'll explain you line by line, just in order to save some time of writing a lot of lines and wasting time, okay. So this is a test which I have written to set an access token and refresh token on a successful register, okay. So whenever we do a successful registration, which we have already tested within our first test, okay, so within the response we just want to check within the headers, do we have a set cookie over there, okay. So basically this is the option whenever we want to set cookie within our headers, and that value should be defined, okay. So that's what it makes sense over here. So basically this is an assertion to check if the headers are set with cookies, and then what we do is we extract all the cookies from our headers, okay. Within this particular method, first it checks if it is an array, then we get all the cookies from there, if not it's just an empty array. So very simple, just plain JavaScript logic, and then we apply an assertion. So we just check within this cookies array, which we can operate the sum operator. So for every cookie that starts with an access token or a refresh token, okay. So this is what we are actually checking within these two assertions. So we must actually have an access token and a refresh token. So if we do not have them, then our test will actually fail, okay. So this is the actual test. So this is another test which will actually check whether the tokens are actually generated with the right payload, okay. So once we register, just as we do over here, first we check if the status is 201, so that is fine, which is not even needed, which we have already tested before. So now we just do the same thing, okay, over here, and set our cookies over there, and then within our cookies object we just check for the access token and refresh token, and we store them within a variable, and we just want to assert to check that if they are even defined, all right. And then we want to check if the access token, whenever we split them by a semicolon, so basically tokens are usually written like that, and we just want to also split that by an equal sign. So we just want to grab exactly the token, okay. So this will be the format in which our tokens are actually set, okay, and we are just checking if this particular logic will actually return a access token or not. So same logic goes for the refresh token as well, okay. So this is nothing much, this is just plain JavaScript logic, which if I just start explaining, it will take a long time, and of course this is out of the scope of this video. So now after getting the access token, refresh token, we just want to decode that using the JWT, the function that we have actually created, okay. So this is actually using the real function. This doesn't do a database operation or anything like that, so it is safe to use this. So then we can decode our access token and our refresh token, and then check if they are even defined, and also with the payload parameters, okay. So we have the issuer, audience. If you remember, we had created within the video of access token and refresh tokens. So those are all the things that are actually need to be defined. So if they are not defined, then our test obviously fails, okay. And also the same goes for the subject, issuer, and all of that stuff. So we want to check the same for the refresh token as well, okay. So these are the basic assertions that we have written. So in this test case, we have written about 8 assertions, basically to strictly check if the access token is set, even if it is set, is it set with the right payload, okay. So this is the test. So you can just have a look, and you can just practice on your own, just to test other functionalities. So this is just for the register. Basically you can also just go ahead and test for the login and other stuff as well. Basically for the to-do routes as well, you can just apply tests just by checking if whenever we create a to-do, it actually stores within our database or not, with the right response, with the status code and all of that. So this is just an example which I am giving you, so later you can just do your own homework. Okay, so this is the two tests which I have just created. So now let's go ahead and do a PNPM test, and let's check if all of our assertions pass. Yes, they do pass. Okay, so basically we have one test suite and we have 6 tests which are actually written, and all of them pass. Okay, so this is the basic testing. So if you actually have a question like what kind of tests are we currently actually using, is it a unit test or integration test? So this particular test that we have so far written is integration tests. Okay, because we are used other functions like this JWT and this token info, all of that. Okay, and also the the user model. So from the user controller we have not actually replace this with a empty function or anything. So we have actually used it. Okay, but not with a real database, but with a fake database. Okay, just for the sake of testing. So that is why this is actually called as an integration test, which we integrate other functions as well within our current function that we are actually testing. So when it comes to unit testing, we just test standalone functions and not any other functions that it depends on. Okay, so you see that this depends on this user.find1 function, which actually is a function which we have currently tested within our integration test. So when it comes to unit testing, so we have to just replace all of these functions with an empty function and then just give it some sample return value. Okay, so that is what we are going to implement next. So before we actually start writing unit tests, let us go ahead and do some cleanup within our registered test file. Okay, so you see that we have written all of these before blocks over here and before and after blocks, so right before our tests. So it would be a good practice, suppose we have multiple files, we have to write the same thing in other files as well. So if it will be better if we separate this particular logic in some other file, and it will be picked up for every test it actually runs. Okay, so currently we just have one test file, so it would be not a problem to remain this here itself. So when we have multiple tests, then it should pick up from the file which that contains all of this logic. So let us go ahead and cut all of this logic within our clipboard and create another file right next to the register ts, maybe called as setup. Okay, so this is basically used to set up our test before it actually runs. So setup.ts, and I can just paste in all of this here, and we can just import all of these stuff right here. So I'm just going to import them manually one by one. So I have just imported all of them. So now we just need to configure vtest to actually use up this setup file that we have over here. Okay, otherwise it will not even understand what exactly is our setup file. So we just need to go ahead and create a config file just for the vtest, just to understand that which are all the test files that it has to track and test them, and which are all the setup files. Okay, so we can just go to the root and create a vtest.config.ts. right here let us import define config from vtest, and that is coming from vtest/config. Alright, so once we import that, we can now go ahead and export it right away using a default export, and let's call this define config, and by calling this function, and here inside this will take in an object where we just pass in the test object over here, which will contain all of our rules that needs to be applied for the tests that we run. So first thing is we want to set the globals to true, which will actually test all the files that we have. And here the most important thing is the setup files, okay, which we have over here, you can just see. And here we just need to pass in an array of files that has the setup. Okay, so currently we just have one file for the setup. We can just now pass in which directory is it in, so that is test/setup.ts. Alright, so once that's done, we also need to provide some more properties, just proper configuration. So we can just set isolate to false. So this basically will prevent re-isolating the environment. Okay, so it should not re-isolate. Then we just have the test timeout. So basically after certain amount of time, so it should not continuously be running our tests if it doesn't even execute. So we just want a timeout after, like, let's say 10 seconds. So you can just pass in 10,000 milliseconds, which is 10 seconds. So now let's yeah, that's it. And sorry, I just made a mistake. This setup file should go to the root of this test folder. And now let's go ahead and run all of our tests and check if these tests are actually running, okay, since we have shifted them within the setup file. So now we run all of our tests by saying pnpm test. So all of them should get picked up and should pass, okay. So the main goal over here is to pick up all these tests that are written within our register test ts and apply our setup file, okay. Actually we are getting all of these error logs over here, checking that if this is even defined or not. So we are getting all the error logs, right? So if you want to suppress them, what you can just do is you can just go to your setup file. Before all, we can just replace all of the console logs, console errors with an empty function. So I have replaced all of the console functions, basically console error, log, warn, everything, by an empty function. So we just import v from vtest, and this has a property called fn. So basically this will actually replace all of the functions. So basically this error, log, warn, everything is a function, right? So all of them gets replaced by an empty function. All right, so basically whenever we try to console log, okay, so instead of using the actual function from console log, so it will just use this one, which is a fake function, okay. So that is what it does. All right, so now let's go ahead and start writing our unit tests, okay. So far we have started with integration tests, where we are depending on other functions for our tests. So now we are completely going to test standalone functions, okay. So whatever the functions that we were previously dependent on, so we are going to mock everything out. Basically we want to replace them by an empty function, okay. So without any delay, let's go ahead and start writing our test. So inside the test folder, I'm just going to create a folder for unit, okay. So basically it stands for unit test, okay. So inside this, I'm just going to create a file for ts, and just for the sake of distinguishing from our regular test, we can just add a unit.test.ts, okay. So you just don't have to do it, but it's a good practice. So unit. So let us copy this particular part of code. So we can just copy this in order to save some time. So I'm just gonna paste it over here and gonna fix those syntax errors. So now if I run this particular test, it is still going to use the actual function that is provided by the user schema, right, from our model, and create a user, okay, within our temporary database. So that is so far we are discussing the integration test. However, in this particular scenario, we just don't want to use that, we just want to mock it. So how do we tell vtest that this thing right here should be replaced by an empty function and it should return some value? So basically this user, whatever is actually passed in, okay. So currently we want to mock the user model, right? So our user model is currently located within this model/user model, right? So we can specify the path to v such that it should pick up from this user model file, okay. So right before our test suite, we can just say v.mock, okay. So this is a function which we can call and specify our path where it has to mock, okay. So the path is /, so two directories behind, then source/user model. So make sure you spell this right, okay. So from this file, we need to bring up our own mock implementation, okay. So such that we need to specify mock v that it should not pick up from this user model file, but we need to come up with our own implementation. So for that, we need to create a mocks folder inside this models folder, okay, over there, and it will pick up that particular file, okay. Sorry, this is models/user model, okay. And also let's import v. Now what we need to do is go inside this models file where our actual user model.ts is actually present over there. So inside here we need to create another folder, okay, exactly this name, called as __mocks __, okay. So like this. So this will explicitly be picked up by vtest, and instead of going to this user model, that is the path that we have specified over here, it will find that there is a __mocks folder, and it will go inside this and pick up the contents from there instead of over here, okay. So that is the whole setup behind mocking, okay. So inside this mocks, let us create a file over there called as user model.ts with exactly this name, okay. So user model.ts. So if this name doesn't match this, then it will not pick up that original file, sorry, this mock file, and it will go ahead and pick up the original file, okay. So over here we need to come up with our own implementation. So as I told you, within the user controller, we need to currently mock the find one user and then the create function, okay, that is provided by Mongoose for the user model, right? So here we can just first import v from vtest. Okay, so once we import this, we need to replace those methods with an empty function. Okay, so here we can just specify const, we can just say user model mock. Okay, over here this will actually be an object containing those two properties. One is find one, and this is, we just want to replace this by an empty function, right? So this has a particular property called fn, which is actually a function which is nothing but an empty function. Okay, and the same we also want to do for the create as well. So create v.fn. Okay, so now instead of going to the user model and then picking up those two functions, that is find one and create, it will go inside this underscore mocks folder, and over here we are currently exporting this particular object containing this property v dot, that is user model mock dot find one and create. Okay, so all we now need to do is export these this particular object. So user model mock, and this can be a default export. Make sure you specify the exact same function names that are called over here. Okay, otherwise it will not work. So once we do that, we can just go back to our test file, and once we have imported our mock files from our user mock, now we need to specify the return value, because whenever we call user.create, this returns an object with the user depending on these properties. So whatever you pass it inside that, so that will user object, right? So that's what we need to create a resolved value. Okay, so within a test specific scope. Okay, so we can start by importing the user model mock. So I'm just going to import that from this particular file, user model mock. Okay, so that is coming from this underscore mocks folder. Make sure you're not importing from the user model file. So now we can just go ahead and use this within this test specific block and give it a return value. So now we can say user model mock dot create. Okay, so this is a function which is actually empty. So over here we can just call mock implementation, mock resolved value. So we can just find over here. So we have another property called as return value. So resolved value is something which actually returns a promise. So if you see within our user controller, this actually returns a promise, right? That's why we are setting this as await, not there here. So that is why we set this to mock resolved value, not returned value. Okay, so if it doesn't return a promise, then we use return value. So here we say mock resolved value. Okay, over here we can just specify an object, what exactly it actually returns. So first thing is the underscore id, which is we can just specify some actual id. So here we can just create a dummy id from Mongoose, and I'm just going to store this within mock id and basically call the new Mongoose types function, mongoose.types.object id. So this will just create a object id, and we can just use this particular thing here, because that's what it actually returns, right? Since this is MongoDB, and the first thing is the name, so we can just get that from the user payload dot name. So user payload dot name, and then the email, user payload dot email, and then finally the roles, right? Because that's what it also returns over here. Okay, so here we also need to mock this particular function, that is to get role. So basically when we click on this, this has this particular function that we are actually calling, that is role model dot find one. So we also need to mock this particular function over here. So we can just go to the again underscore mocks and create one file for the role model. Okay, so we can say role model dot ts. Okay, and of course let's import v from vtest. So over here let's create those empty functions within an object. So we can just call this role model mock. Okay, and this is basically an object where we need to mock out the three basic functions. One is the find one, that is v.fn again, and then we have the create and find. Okay, so basically we also have another external library called as vtest deep mocking or something, which when you call that, it will mock all of the functions that we basically have within our model, right? All of these methods. Okay, so instead of specifying one by one, you can just basically use that external package and use that, but just for the simple application I'm not going to use, so just I gave you a hint of that. So now let's also mock out the find method, so v.fn, and also for the create. Okay, so once we do that, let's finally export them. export default and then role model mock. And also it is also dependent on the types, right? So basically this enum type, so that is user and admin, so we can also export that enum just as we exported from our role model file over here. So we don't want to import anything from our role model file inside our test file, okay, otherwise it will start using this. So that is why we also need to specify this within our mocks file like here. So we can just export this as is, and now we can go back to our test file and import them. So over here let's also specify the mock resolved value for the role model as well. So I'm just going to import role model from __ mocks folder dot find one. So because that's what we are actually using it, right, where within this particular file. So that is why we want to give that a mock resolved value. Inside this, let's specify the object, that is first is the underscore id, and this is of course going to be the role id, which is the sample id, sorry, mock id. And then we have the code itself, which is going to be the role code, so that we actually exported that, right, as enum. So we can also import that role code dot user. So that's the default value which we are actually providing whenever we register a user, and the status of course should be true. Alright, so once we have done that, we can go to a terminal and give this a test and check if everything passes, and you see that everything passes. Okay, so you might be wondering, just because of the setup file maybe it is passing, because it might be using the original model files, just as we did for the integration test. So what we can just do is we can just comment out everything that we have within our setup file, and now we can just give this a test by saying pnpf test. So actually it's getting stuck because this particular register file is dependent on the setup ts file, basically creating that MongoDB memory server. So that is why it actually fails. So now if I run the tests, you see that our tests are getting stuck because it still depends on something else which we need to still mock. Okay, so if we go back to the user controller, so you see that it also depends on this particular function, that is key store, right? So basically this particular function uses the key store model. So that is why it's actually getting stuck, because it's not able to find this. Okay, so if you want to, you can just try to comment out this particular code and just try. It will, you see that it will pass. So if I just do that and also comment these out too, and now if I try, it should actually pass. Okay, so now if I give it a pnpm test, you see that now it passes. Okay, and still it gets stuck because we have commented out the setup file. Okay, so I just commented out everything. This is only for integration test and not for unit testing, so that is the reason I have just commented this out just for testing, and later if you want we can just put this back, so that will run all of our integration tests as well. So now let's go back and uncomment this, and now we can just try to fix this within our unit test. So we also need to mock the key store model. Okay, so we can now go to our __ mocks folder, and we can create a file over there for exactly with this name, key store model. So we can copy this from the user model file, so everything that we have onto the key store model over here, and just rename this to key store model. Okay, so now we can just go ahead and import this within our actual test file and then mock that out as well. So I'm just going to duplicate this and import this from key store model like so, and make sure that this spells right, and now we can just go ahead and mock that out as well. So we can just go right next to these mocks and also call the key store model mock that is coming from our mocks folder and not from models. So now we can just mock the create method by giving it a resolved value. So we can call the mock resolved value function, and here this will actually return us few things, right? When we go check our model, the key store model, so that is the primary key, secondary key, then the id itself when it is created, and then the client itself. Okay, so all of these specify over here. So first is the underscore id, which we can still set to the mock id because that's just a fake one. So I'm just going to copy this and paste in here, and then we have the client. Okay, so this is also going to be of object id, right? So we can specify the same thing over here, and then we have the primary key and the secondary key. Okay, so for this primary key and secondary key, we don't know what exactly will be the key. Okay, but we for certainty know that it will be a string. Okay, so we can just set an assertion that this can be of any string. Okay, so we can first say this as primary key, and we can just use the expect from vtest dot. This has a method called as any. Okay, so this is a function which we need to specify what anything can it be, so it can be only of a string, right? So like so, and we can do the same for the secondary string as well, sorry, secondary key. Alright, so this is our mock resolved value. So whenever we create a particular key within our key store by calling this particular function, so whenever we register a user, so this particular function gets called, so with the client, primary key and secondary key. So that's what we have currently mocked. Okay, so now we can just go ahead and run this test and check if it actually passes. So now if I run the test, so it fails. Okay, we are getting a 500 status code. So it says that cannot read properties of undefined reading create. Okay, so actually within our key store model, so we are doing this a default export. Okay, but when you have a look at the key store model, so we are doing a named export over here. Okay, so what we can just do is we can just export this directly by doing a export const key store model. So that should be the exact name just as we are defining within our key store model over here, because that is what we are exporting. So we can just use the same value and then set this to this particular value. Okay, so once we save that and try to run our tests again, this time it should pass. Okay, so yeah, now this is the only thing. So we have currently implemented the mocking for our register user functionality. So currently we have just used 3 assertions also over here. Okay, so we can just add in more assertions, like saying that if this particular function has exactly been called how many times, like by what parameters has it been called, all of those can be checked. Okay, so we can just do a check over here by saying user model mock, and by saying, so within our user controller file, you see that we are calling this find one method from our user. So basically from our user mongoose model, the real object within this email. Okay, so we are just passing it email. So we can just put an assertion checking that if we are even checking if the user actually exists by passing in the email. Okay, so we can just go back to our test over here. So we can just put an expect. So we can use the user model mock, and then we can check for the find one method if it is even called. Okay, so for that we can use many assertions saying to have been called with. Okay, so these are all the methods which you can actually just explore. So you can just have a look to have been called after, before, like once, or how many times, or with what arguments, all of that. So currently we are interested in with what arguments it has been passed. So that is actually the user payload dot email, because that's what we are actually sending. So we can just set that to the value, and of course this should be email. Okay, and over here as well, so we can, instead of hard coding this, we can use the user payload dot email, and for the the name and email. Okay, so within the, like, let's say role controller, we are also calling the find one method over here as well by passing this particular arguments. Okay, so we can just copy this and apply an assertion here as well. Okay, so just so we are making it very strict so that it should call the appropriate functions with the actual values. Okay, and also how many times it has been called and all of that stuff if you actually need it. So we can just say expect the role model mock, so this thing dot find one, and again to have been called with, and with this particular object over here. So now this should be called with the user enum type, right? So we can use the role code dot user, and yeah, so and also we can just apply an assertion for the key store model, because we are using the create function inside that. So if we have a look at the key store controller, so we are using the create one, so we can also check if that has been called. Okay, so over here we can just say expect the key store model, so model mock dot create, and here we can just use to have been called. Okay, so this is just a function which actually checks if it is actually called or not. Okay, so this doesn't check how many times it is being called and all that. So if you want to make it even more strict, so we have another thing called as to have been called times, and then we can just pass in the how many times it has been called. Like in this case it is just one time, right? So we can just pass in one, or we can just stick to the simple one, and yeah, that's it. Okay, so this is called as role model, so we can just call this role model mock just to be consistent here as well. And over here I have exported the role model mock. Okay, that is equal to role model, because this is the actual name, this is the exact name that I have actually exported within my real role model file over here. Okay, so make sure that names actually match. Okay, and over here if you want we can rename it and export them. So with that we can now go ahead and test all of our files and check if they are actually working with these new assertions that we added, and you see that that passes. Okay, and the remaining test gets stuck just as we commented out the setup file. Okay, so this keeps running, don't bother about it. So now we have just completed the testing of registering a user. So if you want we can just go ahead and test this out. Like let's say within this user controller, for example, we are not calling all of these methods and setting the cookie. Okay, so now if I just save this and just try to run our test, so it should fail because this particular function wasn't called. So you see that we are getting an error, expected the spy to be called at least once. Okay, so basically these are all called spying methods. Okay, to have been called a number of times, and all of these are actually called spies. Okay, which are used in conjunction with mocks. So basically we want to spy if that particular function is called, and if it is called by what arguments, how many times, all of that. Okay, so let's uncomment this code. So let's now also test for other functions as well, like setting this cookie and whether the actual tokens are being created or not, with the right JWT payload and all of that stuff. So I have just went ahead of time and written all of these other tests in order to save some time from me to typing. Okay, otherwise it become very boring. So this is the second test which I have written, so which says it should not register a user if the user already exists. Okay, so first thing what we are just doing is we are of course doing the user mock. Okay, so we are just calling the find one method on our user model, and this is the value it has to return. Okay, because this is the function actually it calls within our user controller, right? So once we do that, we just apply our we just act and apply our assertions. So first thing is it has to give a status code of 400, because whenever it calls this find one, it has returned some value, right? So that is what we are actually checking within our user controller. So if the value actually exists, then it returns a 400. Okay, so that's what we are actually expecting over here, because it is returning a value, and then it should give us a message saying that user already exists. Or if you don't want to be very strict, you can give it a saying that this has to match a particular regex, saying that it has to consist of the word exists. So instead of this we can just say to match, and here we can just pass in our regex consist of the word exists, like so. Okay, so in order to not be too specific, so just wanted to say that over here. And also we apply some spying. Okay, so we just want to check if the user model dot create is not have to be called. Okay, so basically if you don't want something to be called, so we can just invert that by just prepending the not method on this. Actually it says not to have been called, makes sense, right? So the same goes for the role model mock and also the keystone model mock. Okay, so sometimes even though the user actually exists, so all of these functions will be called, which is actually unnecessary, right? So of course we are actually asserting that as well. So these functions should not be called in order to make it more strict. Okay, so in case, so within our user controller it should return here itself, otherwise it will go ahead and call all of these functions which actually should not be called. So that is why we are actually asserting that. So if you don't give it a return here, it will just go ahead and execute the rest of the code. So that is why we are asserting these things here. And the next test is basically it should return 400 with an invalid email. So basically if we are doing a regex check, right, within our sort validation, if this is actually an email or not, so we can just just provide that invalid email, just some random string, and then make the request, and then we do the assertions. Basically we need a 400 status code, and then the rec.body.message should be like invalid email. So, and also all of these particular functions should not be called. So that's what I have done the assertions here. Okay, so this is the thing. And next is it should return 400 with an invalid password. So basically password length should be at least 6 characters. So I have just entered 3 characters and then made the request, and this is the message body it has to return, like saying that password must be at least 6 characters long. And then again all of these functions should not be called. Okay, and then we also have another check. If we send a blank body, basically if with no email and password, again it has to be doing the same thing. Okay, and over here I have just used the regex, which saying that all of these are required basically. So that is email and password. So basically we are just passing in the invalid payload with just the name and not email and password, and these are all the checks which we are making. Okay, and then we are also checking if registration fails due to your duplicate email. So basically first we register a user, and then again when we try to register a user we should get 400. Okay, and here we are just using the mock value. Basically when we want to find a user which is already existing, so this is what it returns. And whenever we try to make another request again, so this is the first time, this is the second time, and for the second time we need to expect the response to be 400. And also we are checking even the headers, because once the user is registered we also want to check the headers are set or not. So when the headers are set, it will be set by this particular property called set cookie, and this should be undefined. So this is also another value which you can apply to check if that has some value or not, if it is even defined or not. Okay, so all of these values you can also find within the documentation, all of these assertions. So you can, based on your requirement, you can just use them within your tests. Okay, so this is basically all the other functions that should not have been called. All right, and this is a crucial part, that is about access tokens and refresh tokens on successful registration. So whenever we make a registration, so whenever we make a successful registration, so basically the user should not be existing, right? So basically that's what it's checking here. So basically you don't need this, basically it should return null. And this is the result value whenever we create a new user, so that is the underscore id, name, email and roles. Okay, and then once the user registers, it has to create a access token and refresh token pair, right? So this is what the actual key store model function returns. One is the access token and refresh token, that's what we have actually implemented. And now we just make the request and then make some assertions saying that it has to return a status code of 201, which means that something is created. And then we just want to check if our headers is even defined. Okay, so if it is defined, we call the to be defined method. Okay, and also on the set cookie, it has to not just store some random cookie, right? So we need to check the actual value if it is even an access token or refresh token. So here we just check whether this is an array or not. So basically our headers contain an array of cookies, right? So first we just grab them and then check for every value we contain this word called as starts with access token equals, and then the same for refresh tokens. Okay, so basically we are just collecting every cookie within an array and just checking if we are actually having these values or not. Okay, so this is to check whether our access token and refresh tokens are actually created when a user registers. And finally we have this test which should generate tokens with the correct payload. Okay, so here we are just creating a random role id and then giving it a return value for the role mock. So basically a role should be created of the user, and then the user should have a like mocked value, and then when we create a user, so this should be the return value. And then also while creating the tokens, so basically we are just calling the key store model, and this is what it should return, the client primary key and secondary key, and just as we saw in the first test. And then we just make the request, and then first we have all done this particular steps in the previous test as well. So here we now check if the access token cookie and the refresh token cookie that we have received is even defined. Okay, so then the next step is within this access token we just want to split based on this semicolon. So basically whenever we set cookies on headers, right, so it will be in this particular format. Okay, so we are actually checking whether this format is actually correct or not. So basically it shouldn't create any other kind of token in the wrong format. So that's what we are checking over here, and using this particular check we are checking if we are still getting access token, refresh token, and also based on that we want to decode them. Okay, so basically we are using the JWT function and then decoding them. Once we decode that, we check if it is first defined, and then we check the issuer, the audience, and having the right values from our environment variables, that is from token info dot issuer, audience, and all of that stuff. Okay, and we are doing the same for the refresh token as well. Okay, so all of this we have already seen within our integration tests as well. Okay, so the same logic over here. So let's uncomment all of these setup files that we have just for our integration testing. So we have just tested that without even our setup files, our unit tests are working without actually depending on our MongoDB memory server. So now let's go ahead and run all of these tests, including the unit as well as the integration test. So we can just do a PNPM test now, and let's check if all of our 14 tests pass, and they do pass. Okay, so yeah, I guess this concludes the video about unit testing and integration testing, how they are actually crucial in any backend project. So I hope you like this video, and I'll struggle a little bit to create this video, and also it that's why it took a little bit of delay in order to create this video. So I apologize for that, and also for this long video. So if I made many mistakes, sorry for that. So thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share this if it actually helps you. So I'll see you guys in yet another exciting video on this Node.js backend architecture series.